And a hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 38 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. As we sit 2 days after Christmas on a very happy hump day here in New York. If you're joining me on the YouTube channel, please don't forget to click like and subscribe. Or if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast on any of the platforms such as Spotify or iTunes and you enjoy the content, please click like and subscribe. So in the 37 episodes that I have done so far of this podcast, and I've had a great time interacting with so many of you and doing my best to put out interesting content, regardless of whether you're listening in the car or you're watching a YouTube video, which you could technically also be doing in the car. But I've shared a lot about my life in terms of things I am interested in, have been interested in. But one thing I haven't mentioned yet, to my knowledge, a very important part of my life, and I'm sorry to all of you Met fans out there, but I grew up a diehard, bleeding Yankee blue New York Yankees baseball fan. It's kind of a tradition in the Cohen family. My father was a diehard Yankee fan. He was a Yankee fan from 1951. I mean, he used to talk about that he didn't really remember much. He was sitting in front of famous games when he was 5 and 6 years old, but didn't have any memories. But 51, kind of a magical year in Yankees history because they beat the miracle New York Giants. That was the Bobby Thompson year where the New York Giants basically cheated their way past the Brooklyn Dodgers that season. But 1951, when we hear of famous legendary names, not just Yankees, but in baseball, two names that will come up where even a casual fan who just knows a little bit about baseball history, invariably, they know who Joe DiMaggio is, and some people know him because he was married to Marilyn Monroe, but they know of Joe DiMaggio and they know of Mickey Charles Mantle, the Mick, the Commerce Comet, Mickey Mantle. Well, 1951, and the Yankees had the kind of magical history where stuff like this, you say, how could this be? But it is. 1951 was Joseph Paul DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper, for decades considered the greatest living ball player, was his final season. He wasn't even really that old. I think he was 36, but his body was just chewed up. He was shot. It was Joe DiMaggio's final season, and a 19/20-year-old rookie named Mickey Mantle, it was his first season. And that was my dad's first fan season. He was 8 and then turned 9 during that season. So my father was a diehard Yankee fan, which takes on different forms depending on how old you are and depending on the era. How many TVs did you have in your house? What was your work schedule like? Did you get to see all of the games or a good percentage? All that kind of stuff. My father was a fan from 1951 until he passed in August of 2022, the year that Aaron Judge famously broke Roger Maris's home run record. And my dad was still watching the games, sadly, from a hospital bed, and he got to see Aaron Judge's, I believe it was his 38th home run of that season. It was a game in Boston. The Yanks ended up losing. They lost a lot of bad games that year. But Dad instilled in his son, me, his only son, a deep love of and for baseball in general, and the Yankees in particular. Now, I was the sort of child, you could say the same about me as an adult, but when I'm interested in something, I will dive face first. I will learn as much as possible. And in the days where computers were things that we had in offices, didn't really have much in the way of home computers, I was fortunate, as I've been fortunate in so many other areas, like hundreds, that the average person unfortunately is not, which I just happened to get lucky. I had the right parents, whatever you want to say. I had access to stuff that the average kid did not. And even with something as kind of narrow as this, my dad had a great library of general fiction books, but nonfiction books and baseball books in particular. I don't know that he ever actually read these books, but I did. And one of the books was, it was a history of baseball type book that started in 1903. It was a 75th anniversary. What's considered the first year of the modern era of baseball is what? 1903. Why do I know that? I just do. Go back to Walbrook, stay with Charlie Babbitt. But this book was the first 75 years of the so-called modern era of baseball. It was from 1903 to 1978. And I believe the name of the author was Joseph Reichler. And I read that book cover to cover. It didn't have too many pictures. But 6-year-old me, bit precocious, didn't have anything better to do on a rainy Sunday and rainy Saturdays. And when I got home from school and Mom said, do some reading, do your homework. Okay. Then there was another baseball book called The Yankees. And the book was actually called The Money Players. The 4 fabulous eras of baseball's most famous team. Actually, no. The Money Players was the last section of the book. But it was a book breaking the Yankees down into the pre-Babe Ruth era, the Babe Ruth era through, Lou Gehrig into DiMaggio, Mantle, and then the era which was referred to as the era of the money players, the best team that money could buy, all of that. And I read that book cover to cover many times. I read Ron Guidry's autobiography. I read Reggie Jackson's autobiography. I read so many baseball books. I read a book on the World Series. Some stupid fact that I remember from when I was 6 years old is a guy named Babe Adams who pitched for the Detroit Tigers, threw 3 shutouts in the 1909 World Series. Why do I still remember that? Maybe he didn't throw 3 shutouts. I think he did, though. I think I still remember that from having read it all those years ago. But all of this stuff fascinated me as a small boy, let's say first grade age. My brain was still developing. I had a very wide and varied and vivid imagination. And the pictures kind of came to life for me. And even though I didn't really get what I was watching in those early years, because according to legend, and I only remember flashes, and quite frankly, it could be something that I'm remembering different that's not really what I think it is. But both of my parents have said, and the Yankees had a dry period. You go back to literally 1921, when they made the World Series and lost to the New York Giants. From 1921 to 1964, that's 43 years. The Yankees were in the World Series half of the time. You want to know how many World Series they won from 1961 through 64? Okay, they made the World Series in 21 and 22, lost to the Giants. They won the 1923 World Series. They lost the 1926 World Series. Then they won the World Series in 1927 and 28. And there are many people to this day that claim the 27 Yankees, the Yankees of prime Babe Ruth, prime Lou Gehrig, were the greatest baseball team ever assembled. 1932 Yankees, they beat the Cubs. That was a Babe Ruth famously pointed in the general direction of something or other, and they gave him credit for, he called his shot. Babe pointed his finger where he was going to hit. I don't believe that. Bullshit. But it makes for a great story. Babe Ruth called his shot. Then the Yankees won 4 consecutive World Series in 4 straight World Series appearances. 1936, 37, 38, 39. Had a down year in 1940. Came back to win it in 41, the year of what? Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak. He's just a man and not a freak. Joltin' Joe DiMaggio. Yeah, that Joe DiMaggio. Think about it. Ted Williams. The Ted Williams. The splendid splinter. The greatest hitter who ever lived. Ted Williams hit 406 that year. The last man to hit 400. He didn't even win the MVP award, for crying out loud. Joltin' Joe DiMaggio. Joe DiMaggio, we want you on our side. He's just a man and not a freak. Yeah, he authored baseball's famous streak. That's the first that set us all aglow. He's just a man and not a freak. Joltin' Joe DiMaggio. The Yankees lost the World Series in 42. Then they came back to win it in 43. Then World War II, although World War II had started disrupting baseball, a lot of players, such as Joe DiMaggio, such as Ted Williams, ended up serving, and they weren't just, doing appearances and goofing around. They were actually in active combat. Ted Williams was a gunner in the Air Force. He said he was like the greatest pilot they ever saw. If you think about it, Ted Williams had coordination that was almost inhumanly good. So of course he was an incredible pilot, because he was able to do things, not to be a schmuck, he was able to do things with his hands that the average person couldn't even conceive of. He was able to hit a 100-mile-an-hour fastball coming to him in an eighth of a second. He did not have coordination of a normal skilled person. His coordination was about 50 times that of a normal skilled person. You could say the same for DiMaggio. But Yanks come back from war. Everybody came back from war. The Yanks won the World Series in 1947. Joe Page comes out of the bullpen to save the day. They won the World Series again in 1949. Then they won it in 1950. Then they won it in 51, as I mentioned before. Then they beat the Dodgers in 52, and they beat the Dodgers in 53. In 54, the Yankees won 100 games, didn't make the World Series. Cleveland did, but they lost the World Series to the New York Giants. That was the World Series where Willie Mays in the first game made that crazy over-the-shoulder catch. Still considered the greatest catch in baseball history. 1955 is a season I've written about. I had a screenplay that nearly got produced a long time ago about the Brooklyn Dodgers one time winning the World Series. They finally got one over on the Yanks. The Yanks had beaten them in 41, 47, 49, 52, and 53. Brooklyn finally got him in 55. The Yankees came back to beat him in 56. That was the year Don Larson threw a perfect game in Game 5. The Yanks won the World Series in 58. They lost a terrible World Series to Pittsburgh in 1960. Bill Mazeroski hit a walk-off homer in a game the Yanks should have won by multiple runs. 1961, the year of the home run chase. Roger Maris, 61 and 61. Mickey Mantle, 54. The Yankees won that World Series. Then they came back the next year, 1962, and won that World Series. But then they lost in 1963. They got the shit beat out of them by the Dodgers. Sandy Koufax was unhittable. And they lost a tough 7-gamer. Mantle was kind of slowing down to the Cardinals and Bob Gibson in 64. And then, in like a Star Wars way, then came the dark times, the dog days, the worst era in the history of the storied Yankees franchise. They did not make another postseason, and it was different then because in 1964, there was no layers of playoffs. You either finished first or you didn't finish first. You didn't start division play until later on, it was the first year, 68 or 69, I'm not sure. I think it might have been the year that the Mets in 69, but you know what, I could be wrong. I don't know the first year of what was known as the championship series, or what they used to call they're playing for the pennant. There was no playing for the pennant. Whoever had the best record in the American League faced off against the best record in the National League in the World Series. You won the pennant by finishing first. But the Yankees did not make a World Series or postseason until 1976. Now, 76 is a magical year for the Yankees, even though they ended up not winning the World Series, because Old Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, OG Yankee Stadium, which when it was opened in 1923, it was built brick by brick. I know that's a cliche. It was built brick by brick from the ground up. It was the most modern ballpark anyone had ever seen, circa 1923. It ran rings around Wrigley Field, Fenway Park, the other parks that were still, and of course Fenway Park is still around today, 111 years after it was constructed and play began there. They retrofitted Old Yankee Stadium. So when the ballpark reopened, the Yanks actually played at what used to be called Shea Stadium, near, across the street from Citi Field today. The Yanks played there 1974 and 1975. The Mets and Yanks kind of split time. And what was called the new stadium, which was not really a new stadium, it looked new, but they used the existing structure and just put, let's just say, a very nice new coat of fresh paint on it, and rebuilt a lot of stuff and modernized as much as they could. So 1976, first year of the remodeled Yankee Stadium. I was 2 years old. Now, my dad tried to get tickets to the first game, could not. I mean, it was sold out, but everything was like, that really wasn't the issue. He knew somebody who could get him a ticket for the second home game in April of 76. So he took that. And unfortunately, no pictures exist of this, but we went to game 2. I believe it was April either 16th or 17th, but the second game ever at the remodeled Yankee Stadium. 2-year-old me with my parents. My dad would have been 33. My mom would have been 31 in April of 1976. So that year, after a dozen years of no postseason, the Yankees had a big season, ended up making the pennant, beating the Royals in a crazy, and it was 5-game series, by the way. It was best out of 5. Then it would later become best out of 7. So it was the American League East, American League West, National League East, National League West. The Yankees had the best record in the East, the Royals best record in the West. They played for the pennant. And in a crazy series and an insanely exciting and breathtaking final game, Chris Chambliss hit a walk-off home run to send the Yankees to the 76 World Series. And the video is just unbelievable because there are hundreds of cops. There's so much security on the field, and it doesn't matter because 10,000 people charge the field. And Chris Chambliss, who hit the winning home run, never actually got to touch home plate. When he saw what the field looked like, he's just like, I gotta get the fuck into the dugout. It's one of the great moments is that as he's charging to the dugout, he's moving back and forth like Jim Brown, like a running back. And some guy, a cameraman, is standing there and Chambliss fucking levels him. I mean, he knocked the guy flat. Like, I was like twirling backwards. He hit him so hard. You know, Chris Chambliss, by standards of professional athletes, was normal size, but by normal person standards, he was a big dude. So the Yanks went to the World Series in 76, lost, got swept by the Cincinnati Reds. And my long-winded, boy, it took me a while to get to this point, 1977, the Yankees signed a guy who was already on his way to the Hall of Fame, most likely, because it was inevitable he was going to get to 500 home runs. A huge character, one of the first real characters in baseball, Reginald Martinez Jackson. Reggie, if you prefer. And the Yankees signed Reggie. George Steinbrenner, the owner at the time, signed Reggie as a free agent. He had come up with the A's, and then he spent a year with Baltimore in 76. And then the Yankees spent a lot of money to get him in 77. And statistically, he had a phenomenal year for the time. 32 homers, 110 ribbies. Even though the fans didn't entirely embrace him, because Reggie was not, he was a hot dog. He was a character. He didn't do things the normal Yankee way. And I know that's another cliche. We hear it all the time. This guy's not a true Yankee. I remember A-Rod when he got to the Yanks. Oh, he's not a true Yankee. Yeah, because A-Rod didn't get his own coffee. You know, he had a clubhouse guy. You tip him $100 to get him his coffee. He's not a true Yankee. Or he's no Jeter. All that stuff. Reggie went through that. And he put up an incredible season in 77. And they were still bitching and moaning. And Billy Martin was busting his chops. Actually sat him down in a playoff game. Reggie was already had a huge reputation for being a pressure player. He had been terrific in the 72 postseason until he busted his foot, I think. 73 against the Yanks had a big against the Mets had a big World Series, and Billy Martin just hated his guts. Billy Martin sat him down against a Kansas City lefty named Paul Splittorff, which was just absolutely insane. And Billy got ragged at the time for it. It's like, bro, this is your best hitter, and you're sitting him down now in the biggest game of the year? Fucking idiot, what are you doing? Anyway, Reggie Jackson famously, in Game 6 of the 1977 World Series, hit 3 home runs against the Dodgers, against 3 different pitchers, on 3 consecutive swings. That is something which will never happen again. He hit the homers off Bert Hooton. Happy Hooton. Great nickname because he looked like he was miserable. He never smiled. Happy Hooton. Gotta love nicknames like that. Call a guy happy when he's not happy. Elias Sosa. Reggie hit a fucking frozen rope just over the wall and right. And then famously, most famously, the third off Charlie Huff, the knuckleballer, who pitched for like another 25 years after this. Reggie hit a ball dead center into the black. Probably a 500-foot blast. And boy, did he stand there at home plate admiring it. So what my parents told me is that they plucked me out of bed and put me in front of the TV as they watched the last 3 outs in the top of the 9th inning. I feel like I remember images and flashes of what the stadium looked like that night on my parents' black and white television in their room in the old house in Massapequa, but I could be remembering something else. What can I tell you? But yeah, 1977, first World Series that they won in 15 years since 62. Then they came back, an incredible season, a huge rally from 14 games down to Boston. They end up winning the 78 World Series. And 1980, I remember watching the playoffs, but it didn't make much of an impression. 1980, the Yankees got swept by the Royals. The Royals were due. The Yankees had gotten them in 76, 77, 78. They had to win one. The Royals were just too good to lose every year. 1981, I watched a significant chunk of that World Series with Dad. That was a disaster. Probably the worst World Series in Yankees history. They won the first 2 games against the Dodgers at Yankee Stadium. Went to L.A., had leads in games 3, 4, and 5, lost them all. Came back home in game 6, had another lead, lost that too, lost the series. And then the Yankees did not make the postseason for 14 years. 14 freaking years until 1995. And I watched every pitch, if I could, of every game, even when the team was on the West Coast, when I got old enough to make my own bedtime decisions. And ironically, and it's a little sad, my Yankee fandom was at its peak when the team was shit, not when they were great. Because by the time they got great again in the mid-90s, and then famously winning 4 World Series in 5 years, 1996, 98, 99, and 2000, I still watched the games, but it wasn't as big a part of my life. I was in college. I'm trying to establish myself professionally after college. Priorities shift. It's life. But I'll tell you, my dad, yes, his priorities shifted from when he was a 9-year-old boy watching Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio in the first game of the 1951 World Series. But nothing made him happier. Now, he didn't enjoy the stress of the games. I should point that out. There were times where he just couldn't take it, and he would turn it off and say, you know what, I'm going to check back in an hour. I'm going to give myself a heart attack. Like, he was that kind of fan where he would, my dad was not a guy who was known for his temper, but there were various little, scuff marks and shit in the old house in Massapequa in the downstairs area where we had one of the big TVs. Hey, what's this mark over here? Oh, I call that the Great Shoe Mark. The Great Shoe Mark? He says, yeah, there was a Yankee game against the Red Sox in 77 where Bucky Dent screwed up a double play, and I thought we were going to lose the game, and I threw my shoe. The Great Shoe Mark. But sometimes even he would be like, no, I don't want to do it. But bliss for him, at least conceptually, come home after a hard day of work, and a long commute home, I should say. And the Yankee games used to start at 8 o'clock in those days, 70s and 80s. Sit down and watch the Yankee game. Whether the year was 1985, 1995, then as he kind of slowed down a little bit into the 2000s, as the roster and everything changed, nothing brought him a feeling of contentment like sitting in front of the TV and waiting for first pitch, watching the pregame show after he retired and had the opportunity to do things like watch pregame shows and get more into the stats and analysis, listen to more sports talk radio. He loved Mike and the Mad Dog. He used to listen every day. He enjoyed all of the shows, that era. Russ Salzberg and Steve Summers. Jody Mack, do me a favor. Hey, Jody Mack, do me a favor. Fire Bucky Dent. All that stuff was amazing. I, again, because of my blessed childhood, and again, we're talking within reason. My dad wasn't a multi-millionaire. He was a guy who did very well for himself, and he was in an industry where often your firm, your company, would have season tickets. The idea being, yes, you're flexing, right, but take clients to games, and maybe you'll get more business. There was always a method to it, but the upshot of it is that the old Shulman Conan first, SCF & Co., they had season tickets. And I got to go to a lot of games. Now, I went to games during Yankee playoff runs, which are now considered iconic, legendary playoff runs, but I myself was never at any of those famous games. I mentioned earlier the Chris Chambliss game in 1976, Game 5. I wasn't there for Game 5. I was at Game 3. My parents and I were at Game 3, and there's supposedly a picture of me sipping beer that my mother has stashed somewhere. I haven't seen it in 35, 40 years. But yeah, I was at Game 3 of that famous series. I just wasn't at a famous game. I was at the series where Derek Jeter did the shovel pass. It was also the same series where Jeter went into the stands to make a catch, if I'm not mistaken. I was not at either of those games. I was at the game where the Yankees beat Tim Hudson, who had unhittable stuff. The Yankees beat Tim Hudson in, I believe, Game 3 with a bunch of bloopers and bleeders and pop-ups. But I was not at any of the famous games of that series. The next postseason game that I went to was in 2004. It was actually the last one that I went to, now that I'm thinking about it. And I got to see the Yanks unfortunately lose the first game to the Twins. The next game was one of Alex Rodriguez's finest moments as a Yankee until 2009, where the Yankees were actually down in the bottom of the either 12th or 13th inning. They were about to go down 2-0 in a 5-game best out of 5 series when they had a rally off Long Island native, Stony Brook, Joe Nathan, and A-Rod put one into the left center field gap to tie the score. It should have won the game, but it bounced over the wall. So I didn't get to go to that famous game. It's just the way that it works out. Sometimes you're there when you see something magical. And I just was never at any of the super famous, postseason games. Now, my dad he went to a game in 1999. It was somewhat humorous. It was Yankees Red Sox during that crazy series. It was Texas. It was the first round where Don Zimmer got hit in the head by a foul ball. And they were worried because he had a metal plate in his head. And then they put like a military helmet on him in a dugout. And everybody was going nuts. And that was one time where social media existed, but nothing, and the internet existed. But nobody at the ballpark knew what was going on in the dugout. And on TV, Bob Costas, they're cracking up. They're laughing because Zimmer's in the dugout laughing, wearing this military helmet. And my dad called me. I was right in front of the TV in Huntington. And he called, and he's like, "What the hell's going on? Are you watching the game?" I said, "Yeah, I'm watching the game." He says, "I don't understand. Why is there a stoppage? What's happening?" Well, what's happening is that Don Zimmer got hit with a foul ball, and they put a hat, like some kind of a military garb hat on his head, a helmet, and everybody in the dugout is cracking up, and I think even the Texas Rangers are laughing. So the Yankees in that era, from 2000 to 2009, did not win any World Series. They had big teams. In 2001, they had a great run, and they lost a terrible series to the Diamondbacks. Actually, I believe that was the year that Jeter went into the stands to make a catch. Not the famous going into the stands against the Red Sox. This was a different one where Derek also got banged up, but not as badly. 2002, they got knocked out in the first round. 2003, they got to the World Series and lost to a Marlins team they should have been able to beat, but they didn't. 2004, disaster, 3-0 lead in the American League Championship Series to a flawed Red Sox team. Boston came back to win 4 in a row. 2005, flame out in the first round. 2006, flame out in the first round. 2007, flame out in the first round. 2008, missed the playoffs. 2009, sadly, the final World Series winning team that both my father and I got to enjoy. And we watched most of the games together. And he was as excited as he ever was. And he was mostly retired by that point. He was down to working 2 to 3 days a week. But he would still get giddy. He would still stand and cheer. At that point, already 58 years of Yankee fandom, and he would still be standing and cheering. And on the last out of the 2009 World Series, a grounder to second, Robbie Cano, Teixeira, I think, had he injured himself? Oh, no. But Teixeira was still there. That was a different series that Teixeira got hurt. But we were celebrating along with him. The first year, and 2009 was the year that they had the new, literally the new Yankee Stadium. So here we are in 2023. The Yankees have gone 14 years without winning a World Series, despite the fact they've had a lot of big teams, but the extra layers of playoffs, it's totally different. It's way more of a crapshoot. Now, listen, as much as those early Yankee teams, 20s, 30s, 40s, early 60s, were monster teams, if there were extra layers of playoffs, even the 27 Yanks could have got bumped off in a best out of 5. It's baseball, Susan, as John Sterling, the Yankee broadcaster, famously says. It's baseball, Susan. Now, I'm going to wrap this up now, but you can see baseball, like movies, is a topic, and especially Yankees, I can talk about for hours. I love baseball. It will always be a big part of my life. And, I make no apologies, and I know plenty of people think that it's boring. That's fine. It's not for everybody. I love football too, but baseball is really my rooting sport. And with that, we've come to the end of episode 38 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. If you haven't already, and you're watching this YouTube video, please click like and subscribe. I'll be back real soon with episode 39. Take care, everyone, and swing away.